Do you like games? I like games. Do you like games too? I like games too. I like games too. Hello, my name is Peter Franson from ChristianGeekCentral.com and Spiritblade Productions, and I like games. All right, let's talk about some Baldur's Gate. Well, first I want to give you my background as a gamer. I primarily started out as a console gamer. Like Final Fantasy was my bread and butter. Turn-based Japanese RPGs. Sometimes like a strategy RPG, mainly Final Fantasy Tactics for the longest time was the only one in that category that I'd played. So really this kind of traditional Japanese turn-based RPG was what I was into for the longest time. And then eventually I dipped into some action RPGs, like the Champions of Norath, Diablo, type games. And then I got into real-time with pause games, so Neverwinter Nights, which at first was a really hard transition for me to make. I tried the game and then was like, screw it, and left it alone for a year, came back to it, adapted to it, and loved it. And then after Neverwinter Nights, I played Knights of the Old Republic, and then Dragon Age Origins, and then eventually moved into the Elder Scrolls series. So that's kind of where I've started. And all of that with I want to say almost no exceptions, very few exceptions, all console games. Well, after all of that, after kind of discovering the entire breadth of RPGs available out there, because I'm a huge RPG fanatic, I wanted to try the early BioWare RPGs, because I loved Neverwinter Nights, loved Knights of the Old Republic, loved Dragon Age Origins. Those are all BioWare games. They also made the Mass Effect games. I mean, these guys know RPGs, and I just had heard great things about these Baldur's Gate games, So I tried them, and initially Baldur's Gate was just too hard. I dropped it very soon after buying the game, and it wasn't like until 2 or 3 years later that I came back to try it again with some adjusted expectations. This review isn't for people who have played any of the Infinity Engine games and never had to use a cheat code to beat them. Except for maybe Planescape Torment. I've just started that game, and I understand the combat is just a very different story. It's not as near as hard or tactical as the other games. But if you've played Icewind Dale 1 or 2 and not had to use any cheat codes to beat that or make life easier for you, this isn't for you. I mean, congratulations, you are too smart for this review and you're not going to find it useful at all. And you've probably already played the Baldur's Gate games anyway. No, this review is for those who don't even know what the Infinity Engine is, which, by the way, is the game engine that Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, Icewind Dale 1 and 2, and Planescape Torment were all made on. So this is reviews for those used to console RPGs like the early Final Fantasy games and modern console RPGs like Dragon Age and the Elder Scrolls. This review is for you guys, you console gamers. For those new to the Baldur's Gate series, these games could be described as real-time tactical RPGs with a tactical pause interface. So a bit like a real-time strategy game, except you have the option to pause anytime you want. And give orders to your different units. You can control up to 6 characters in the Baldur's Gate games, each of whom interacts differently with every other combination of characters that may be in your party. These games have a lot of good storytelling and flavor. The dialogue is very strong, and the voice acting was ahead of its time in the video game world, still ranking among the best video game voice acting produced today. The Baldur's Gate games have some unforgettable and likable characters. All of these elements combined do a lot to help overcome the visual limitations of the games. The main gameplay view is a fixed isometric perspective, much like the Diablo games. The character graphics are primitive and lack detail by today's standards, with animation that looks choppy. That said, the pre-rendered graphics which make up the locations and backgrounds look great even by today's standards, if you don't mind the fixed perspective. And mods available for the game will allow you to adjust screen resolution, which improves the perceived fidelity of the images if you don't mind all the characters being a bit smaller. Either way, the intended look and feel of the games still effectively communicates the nature of the game world, which I think is the most important job of game visuals. The visual designs of the numerous spells are also fun to watch and convey the sense of power that are appropriate to the genre. Put simply, if you like eye candy, well, don't be afraid to give these games a try. If you adjust expectations and think of this as either an indie game or a digital version of a really awesome fantasy board game, I don't think the visuals will disappoint at all. So just adjust your perspective, your expectations, and there's a lot visually that you can still enjoy with these older games. Even more so, the sound design has aged very well. In fact, I'd argue it hasn't aged a day. The music is expertly orchestrated and sounds almost live, despite the use of instrument and vocal samples. It's soundtracks like these that have transitioned me from collecting film scores to collecting video game scores. Beautiful, epic, intense, and foreboding. The perfect score for every situation creates a fantastical and cinematic experience that transports players to another world. The game also has wonderful sound design. Crunching footsteps and clanking armor bring the simple movements of your party members to life. Looting fallen foes is accompanied by the sounds of scraping metal, jingling coins, and rustling fabric. Even the buttons in game menus have a chunky wooden clicking sound that makes me happy for reasons I can't guess. For fans of dungeon crawls, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 both deliver in major ways. There are numerous character class options, including multi-classing, to really customize your party members, although you'll want to create your own party from scratch to truly take advantage of these options. There is tons of loot to find, to sell, to buy. There's an extensive magic system to wrap your head around and master. All the layered complexity of Dungeons & Dragons is here, but without most of the number crunching. The combat is very satisfying and tactical. It requires you to constantly be on your game, even early on. Combat uses the rules for 2nd edition Dungeons & Dragons, but the computer handles all dice rolls and most of the number crunching behind the scenes. The passage of turns and rounds happens in real time, and the player may and should pause the action whenever they want in order to give specific commands to individual characters. The game comes with some AI presets you can give to your characters, but much of the time you'll want to give them your own commands in response to the ever-changing combat situations. For me, combat was very enjoyable for much of Baldur's Gate 1, but became a serious shortcoming of the games starting late in Baldur's Gate 1 and getting worse through much of Baldur's Gate 2. I found it especially frustrating at the end of Baldur's Gate 2 and in the expansion Throne of Baal. The reason is that combat doesn't just become more difficult as the game progresses, it actually changes in its very nature. See, in most of Baldur's Gate 1, my combat experience was about managing hit point levels, equipping the right weapons, taking out spellcasters early, all the basic yet satisfying tactics you'd be expected to master in most any RPG. But as the games progress, enemies increasingly have immunities to various types of damage. Immunities that you are only able to discover by trial and error. Additionally, enemies more frequently cast status effect spells on your party that come in a variety of names but largely have the same effects. Sleep, stun, charm, berserk, fear, and confusion, just to name a few, all result basically in removing party members from your control. I hate this for the same reason I hate player elimination in board games. Games should never tell you that you can't play them anymore. And on a certain level, that's what these kinds of spell effects do to you. You can use spells to prevent some of these effects, but there's virtually no way to predict when you will need which kind of protection. And since you can only have a limited number of spells equipped during combat, this can get pretty frustrating. I found myself repeatedly getting into fights that I would have to just quit and reload my last save in order to better prepare for. I would prefer to have the ability to get myself out of challenging situations in the midst of combat without having to be able to predict the future or reload my last save with the advantage of hindsight. And yes, I played these games on the easiest difficulty setting available. So considerably harder, I think, than the games that evolved out of them, such as Dragon Age. Making matters worse is trying to keep track of what each spell at my disposal could do, and which characters had access to which spells. One spell will remove fear, but it won't prevent fear. Another would prevent it, but not remove it. Some restorative spells only my wizard could cast, and some only my cleric could cast. Now, in the good old days of Final Fantasy, status-curing spells had much broader application and could predictably be found in my white mage's spell inventory. But nothing about the magic system in Baldur's Gate 1 and 2 is intuitive. At least not when you get later, like I said, toward the end of Baldur's Gate 1 and on. If you're not intimately and specifically familiar with the 2nd edition rules for Dungeons & Dragons, you'll just have to stumble through repeatedly reading spell descriptions, figuring things out, and trying to remember what spells do what, And again, that's all toward the end of Baldur's Gate 1 onward. In my opinion, the faithfulness to the source material actually hurts the game a bit in this instance. For example, although the game plays in real time, spell effect durations are still described in terms of turns or rounds. And many spell effects change based on your character's level. So like such and such lasts 1d8 rounds per caster level, for example. So even if you know the difference between a turn and a round, which I had a lot of trouble remembering, you'll still have to switch to your character's info page, make note of his level, and do some math to properly factor a given spell into your battle strategy. Now, I ultimately just became familiar with about how effective or about how long-lasting my spells were by simple experimentation. But if intuitive gameplay is a high priority for you, you might as well skip these games, or at least Baldur's Gate 2 and Throne of Bhaal. Despite all of this, there are some workarounds that keep things from getting too frustrating. There are numerous cheats and mods available for the game that I would highly recommend new players explore without feeling any shame. Being able to rest anywhere makes spells much more readily available. Having a bag of holding early on removes annoying carrying capacity restrictions and makes looting all the more enjoyable. In my case, I added what I call the plot sword to my inventory halfway through Baldur's Gate 2. This is a sword that, I think in the inventory, it just says like broadsword or longsword +2 or something like that. But it's a sword that seems to have been used in the developer debugging sessions. It grants the user haste, all kinds of protections, and does 1,000 damage per hit. So is a battle looking too tough and you don't want to reload your save? Advance the plot by unleashing the plot sword to move things along. Numerous mods that are easy to find and install allow you to tweak these games to fit many of your preferences. They don't make the rules less clunky, but they do make the consequences for not understanding them less of a pain. Like many fantasy games and stories, the Baldur's Gate games frequently employ spiritual themes worth considering, either for their truthfulness or falsehood. So as we get into that, let's see. You've got your hypocritical church leaders. Yawn. How many times have we seen that? Good grief. Druids who value trees as much as they value human life, okay. And even a humanitarian rogue. The nature of evil and the soul is explored in these games, as well as themes of salvation and redemption. In fact, there are so many small moments that lightly explore real-world spiritual issues, I couldn't possibly keep track of them all. However, the potential for these elements to actually trigger worthwhile thought or conversation may only be significant for those who haven't had much experience in Dungeons & Dragons-inspired games, or for Christians who actively exercise discernment while engaging in entertainment. For those familiar with this type of experience, these elements may easily fall into the background of classic tropes common to the genre that you just don't think about after a while. Despite the shortcomings of the games, it's easy, though, to recommend at least the original Baldur's Gate, if not the entire series, including Baldur's Gate 2 and the expansion to Part 2, The Throne of Bhaal, which can be found for a great price on GOG.com, GOG.com. There's also like an enhanced edition that has like some additional companions or something that I have not played or had any experience with. And that's, I think, maybe on Steam. But anyway, I was very happy with my experience with what I got at GOG.com, GOG.com. Gamers who like the visual style, storytelling, and gameplay of the Dragon Age games will find its roots in Baldur's Gate. Roots that go deep and have a lot to offer. I give this one a quality score of 8.5 out of 10 and a relevant score of 7.5 out of 10. Well, if you want more information on our scoring system, please go over to ChristianGeekCentral.com for information. Please also do like, share, and subscribe. If you like this, want to share it, and want more like this, then that would be very helpful to me. And then I hope you'll go over to ChristianGeekCentral.com and join us there as we continue to geek out and seek the truth. ChristianGeekCentral.com.